Welcome back to Conflicts of Interest. This is episode 420. I'm the host, Kyle Anzalone. Today joined by co-host Connor Freeman. Connor, how you doing?
Doing very well, Kyle. How are you?
Doing well. Good to have you on the show today. We got a lot to talk about, a lot of Russia news. But first, just want to remind people to share the show. You find it at the Libertarian Institute on the blog at antiwar.com, YouTube, Rumble, and Odysee for the video version of the show. And then you can also find the show anywhere you listen to podcasts. And with that, Connor, let's get into the news today. There have been some recent developments on the battlefield, and it seems from the time that Dave DeCamp wrote up this post at antiwar.com yesterday, there have been some slight territorial gains going Kiev's way near Bakhmut, and a few more than Dave has here, but one particular, they gained about 1.25 miles in an area that's south of Bakhmut, and then on like probably the west side, some farmland in the city or outside of the city. And I read a post online, Connor, that suggested that what happened here was a tactical mistake by the Wagner group, where they went on the offensive in one direction and it left a flank open that the Ukrainians were able to take advantage of. Now they have taken some area north of the city as well, although again, more rural farmland type area the following day. So a couple things could be going on here, Connor. We could be looking at the start of the Ukrainian counteroffensive, and maybe unexpectedly that counteroffensive is going to hit the area of Bakhmut rather than the south, which is what the U.S. has been saying publicly and what everybody has expected. Certainly, the tactical advantages of taking over the southern areas that Russia controls would be significantly more than Bakhmut, but Ukraine has put this, battle up on a pedestal and, really has made it symbolic, and so maybe they are looking to try to have some success around the city. The other possibility here, Connor, if this is a part of the counteroffensive, last year what we saw is that Ukraine poured a lot of soldiers into fighting in these more northern areas of the battlefield. And what Ukraine was really doing was trying to draw Russia's attention away from the south. And by doing so, it helped tactically. Ukraine made some successful gains in some Russian-controlled territory in the south of Ukraine. So maybe we're seeing a replay of that. Or, just as the battle goes, it doesn't always go in one direction, Connor. Sometimes things do go the other way, and that could be a little bit of what we're looking at here. But that is the situation on the battlefield. Now, all right, so Connor, it's not clear exactly what tactics are going on now, and if the spring counteroffensive that's been long anticipated is going on. But it does seem that we're getting some new developments here, because we had heard from the White House that what they were hoping for is Ukraine to make some gains, during the spring counteroffensive, and then hopefully those gains would be enough to leverage and push Moscow to the negotiating table, and then, come to a ceasefire and the conflict. Doesn't seem like that's going to be happening. Ukraine's foreign minister said the upcoming counteroffensive against Russian forces would not be the last. The diplomat urged NATO members to transfer more advanced weapons to Kiev for the upcoming operations, including F-15 fighter jets. In an interview with a German newspaper published on Wednesday, Foreign Minister Dmytro Kuleba said, "Do not consider this counteroffensive as the last one, because we do not know what will come of it," adding that should it fail, it means we have to prepare for the next counteroffensive. For months, the Pentagon has been assisting Kiev in planning its operations, including combat training for Ukrainian troops. President Zelensky has used the forthcoming counteroffensive to lobby for more weapons from his Western backers, telling a Japanese newspaper in March that "we cannot start yet without tanks, artillery, and HIMARS. We cannot send our brave soldiers to the front. We are awaiting the receipt of ammunition from our partner countries." Last week, Ukrainian ambassador to the UK indicated the long-anticipated operations would begin once the weather improves. Recently, American and Ukrainian officials have suggested that counteroffensives to retake territory could fail, raising concerns both in public and behind closed doors. Representative Michael McCall, a Republican from Texas and the chairman of the House Foreign Affairs Committee, said the results of the counteroffensive would have significant sway over whether Ukraine continues to receive U.S. support. If Ukraine is successful in the eyes of the American people and the world, I think it will be a game changer for continued support, he told Bloomberg last week. Continuing, if they are not, it will have an impact in a negative way, though. However, a joint press conference on Tuesday, Secretary of State Antony Blinken and his UK counterpart appeared to contradict McCall, explaining that the future Western backing would not be based on Ukraine's battlefield success. The Ukrainian foreign minister went on to urge additional foreign arms shipments for Kiev, telling the German paper, "It is all about weapons, because to win the war you need weapons, 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 and more weapons," adding that Germany has a lot, and a lot depends on Germany. Earlier this week, the Biden administration announced a new $1.2 billion weapons package for Kiev, including air defenses and artillery ammunition. The Defense Department said the arms will help ensure Ukraine's long-term stability. Still, the Ukrainian foreign minister wants Germany to pressure Washington to send F-16s to Ukraine. The power of German diplomacy should also not be underestimated, the Ukrainian diplomat said, arguing that Germany must play an active role in building a coalition of states to supply aircraft and other advanced systems. While the White House has resisted Kiev's frequent calls for American fighter jets to be transferred to Ukraine, there is some indication that Washington and London are preparing to take the step, as Ukrainian pilots are currently training on Western-made warplanes in the U.S. and U.K. Moreover, the U.S. has previously backtracked after refusing to provide certain weapons, agreeing to provide Patriot missiles and M1 Abrams battle tanks despite declining earlier requests. So, as we said, Connor, I do expect that to come sometime this year, the announcement that we are sending Western-made aircraft to Ukraine. Here we go. Next article, U.S. officials happy the U.K. is preparing to send Ukraine long-range missiles. And so the U.S. officials are breathing a quiet sigh of relief over London's plan to provide Ukraine with longer-range missiles. A final decision has been made, but Britain is preparing to send Kiev missiles with a strike capability of up to 186 miles, which is about the same range as the Army tactical missile system Ukraine has been requesting from the U.S. The missiles the UK is expecting to provide are Storm Shadows, which are air-fired and could be used by Ukraine's Soviet-era fighter jets. And on the last show, Connor, I went over how Ukraine should have about 23 of those now, 13 from Slovenia and 10 from Poland. Last up here, a little bit of good news. China says in touch with all partners on seeking a ceasefire in Ukraine. The Chinese foreign minister said China is willing to maintain communication with relevant parties, including Germany, to achieve an early ceasefire. So let's hope this happens, Connor, but I am not optimistic. And with that, I'm going to hand this over to you. I know the first article you have here is one you wrote for the Institute with Will Porter, breaking down Putin's recent speech.
Yes. So this is Putin's Victory Day speech. And if you read a lot of the Western reports, there was just very few quotes from Putin's speech. And as I was reading it, as it was posted on the Kremlin, I thought that it was relevant to present it to our readership and publish it so that we could give people a better idea of what was actually said. Because they were mostly focusing primarily on, the limited number of troops that had participated in the parade and how pared down it had been and how there was only one tank involved and there were no flyover jets. And they were mainly, saying that he's supporting the war and he's calling his soldiers that have invaded Ukraine heroes. And it presents a sort of a blurry vision of what the speech actually entailed. So what Will and I did was, show people what was actually said and to really give you an idea of what the current rhetoric from the president of Russia is right now as far as how they view the proxy war led by Washington against them, which is what he discussed. So So we write that President Vladimir Putin declared that all of Russia is united in support of its troops, claiming they face a real war intended to destroy their country during his annual Victory Day speech in Moscow's Red Square on Tuesday. Celebrated on May 9th in Russia, Victory Day is the country's yearly commemoration to honor the Soviet troops who defeated the forces of Nazi Germany during World War II. The ceremonies and military parade were notably pared back relative to previous years. However, as Russia's war in Ukraine grinds into its 15th month. So Putin said, today our civilization is at a crucial turning point. A real war is being waged against our country again. But we have countered international terrorism and we will defend the people of the Donbass and safeguard our security. The Russian leader declaimed that Moscow seeks peace and stability while railing against American exceptionalism and the, quote, Western globalist elites. He said these forces pit countries against one another with coup plots and proxy conflicts, such as the 2014 U.S.-backed coup in Kiev, and Ukraine's subsequent war on Russian-speaking separatists in the eastern Donbass region, which was supported by Washington, of course. Now, these actions preceded Putin's invasion, and the president has repeatedly cited the need to, quote, defend the people of the Donbass as justification for his so-called special military operation. And Putin went on to say, for us, for Russia, there are no unfriendly or hostile nations either in the West or in the East. Just like the vast majority of people on the planet, we want to see a peaceful, free, and stable future, Putin claimed. Russians believe that any ideology of superiority is abhorrent, criminal, and deadly by its nature. However, the Western globalist elites, speaking about their exceptionalism, pit nations against each other and split societies, provoke bloody conflicts and coups, sow hatred, Russophobia, aggressive nationalism, destroy family and traditional values which make us human. They do all that so as to keep dictating and imposing their will, their rights, and rules on people, which in reality is a system of plundering, violence, and suppression. The Russian leader went on to claim that the war in Ukraine is a defensive action against a collective West which seeks to subvert and balkanize Russia, ultimately hoping to wipe the country off the map. He said their goal, and there is nothing new about it, is to break apart and destroy our country, to make null and void the outcomes of World War II, to completely break down the system of global security and international law, to choke off any sovereign centers of development. Putin blamed the same forces for provoking the disaster in Ukraine and NATO's ongoing proxy war against Russia, pointing to massive casualties resulting from callous and self-serving Western policies. He said boundless ambition, arrogance, and impunity inevitably lead to tragedies. This is the reason for the catastrophe the Ukrainian people are going through. They have become hostage to the coup d'etat and the resulting criminal regime of its Western masters, collateral damage in the implementation of their cruel and self-serving plans. Putin also hailed the emergence of the new multipolar world, saying that an unstoppable movement is gaining momentum towards a world based on principles of trust and indivisible security, of equal opportunities for a genuine and free development of all nations and peoples. He praised the Russian forces fighting in Ukraine as heroes, saying they're up against a West which has, quote, forgotten what the Nazis' insane claims of global dominance led to. They forgot who destroyed that monstrous total evil, who stood up for their native land and did not spare their lives to liberate the peoples of Europe. And he also went on to, in that same sort of vein, to discuss the fact he accused of certain elements in this Western globalist elite that he's referring to, that they've constructed essentially a cult of Nazis and that they've deployed neo-Nazi scum to attack Russia and to attack ethnic Russians in the Donbass, of course, there's some truth to that, definitely. With, of course, ever since Trump, we've been arming a government which has Nazis like the Azov Battalion literally absorbed into their National Guard. And these are some of the fiercest fighters within the Ukrainian armed forces. Or at least they were. I mean, I'm not exactly sure how many of them still are around after more than a year of the war, but the important thing is that what he was talking about was, as well as the attacks on Russian culture throughout Eastern Europe, in places like Poland and Ukraine, that taking down all of the Russian monuments. And, we just saw in Latvia, Reuters was reporting that Russian speakers are having to take tests in Latvian to prove the Latvian language to prove that they are loyal to Latvia and not to Russia, so that otherwise they'll be expelled. And so there's a lot of persecution of Russians going on, and it's been exacerbated as a result of Putin's illegal invasion. But this is what he's really talking about, which is that hearkening back to all the times the West has invaded Russia over the last several centuries, and especially with the Nazi invasion of the Soviet Union and Russia in World War II. Almost 30 million Russians died in World War II defending themselves from Hitler's forces. And he's just saying as that it's like a total betrayal from the Allies, and just the way Russia has been encircled and menaced and attacked and subverted, and so it's a very interesting speech. And so let's see. He's also, of course, pointing to, when he's talking about the Nazis, and they've forgotten what the Nazis' insane claims of global dominance led to. He's really talking about, or at least I believe that he's referring to the neoconservatives, who do have a policy and have since the end of the Cold War. They've been targeting the Russia, the post-Soviet Russia, and China as well. Not to mention, of course, the Middle East, and really everywhere. But their primary goal is to make sure that there was never an emergence of any rival superpowers to check the power of Washington the world over. And that's the fruition of that Wolfowitz doctrine is essentially what we're seeing today, personified in the Joe Biden foreign policy, Joe Biden and his foreign policy. And so we go on and we say that Tuesday's Victory Day ceremony and military parade were significantly smaller compared to previous years, likely due to concerns over a recent uptick in drone strikes on Russian territory, including one which targeted the Kremlin last week. Moscow claimed the strike was a failed assassination attempt against Putin, pinning blame on Ukraine. Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov also accused the United States of involvement in the attack, saying Russia knows very well that the decisions to carry out such actions, such terrorist attacks, are not made in Kiev. Rather, it is precisely in Washington. While some attendees complained about the scaled-down ceremony, namely the lack of tanks, the Kremlin said the parade's motorized column was headed up by the World War II-era legendary Victory tank T-34-85 and featured a wide array of military hardware, including the Tiger M and BTR-82A armored personnel carriers, Boomerang fighting vehicles, Ixander M tactical missile systems, S-400 air defense platforms, and Yars mobile missile systems, according to the Kremlin. It added that the newest Spartak and 3 STS Ashkamat armored vehicles were presented at the parade for the first time. The marching column consisted of 30 ceremonial regiments with more than 8,000 troops, including 530 personnel taking part in Russia's special military operation, or so-called special military operation. According to the Associated Press, this is the lowest such turnout they've had for troops in the parades since 2008. And there were no, as I say, no flyover jets, and the ceremony lasted less than an hour. Several cities also scrapped their traditional immortal regiment processions, in which crowds hold up pictures of relatives who fought or died during the war against Nazi Germany. The Soviet Union lost 27 million people in the conflict, giving Victory Day deep symbolic meaning in Russia. And I don't know what exactly the veracity of these claims, but in the Associated Press, they were saying that one of the reasons that was the immortal regiment processions were canceled is because they were concerned, Russian officials were concerned that the families of Russian soldiers who have died in the war in Ukraine would come out and hold up pictures of their sons. And that seems plausible. I just don't know if it's been confirmed. But in any case, according to local media reports, 24 cities also canceled plans for their own military parades. Regional officials cited by the AP blamed security concerns as well as the current situation as reason for the cancellations. Alongside Putin on the stand during his speech was the president of Belarus, Alexander Lukashenko. I won't try to pronounce all these other names, but the prime minister of Armenia, the president of Kyrgyzstan, the president of Kazakhstan, the president of Turkmenistan, the president of Tajikistan, as well as the president of Uzbekistan. And so, of course, I think it was also symbolic that the U.S. announced on Victory Day that $1.2 billion arms package from the Ukrainian Security Assistance Initiative, and pledging their commitment to the long-term support and for Ukraine, and also, of course, Blinken and Cleverly coming out and saying that they will essentially keep this war, which they've already admitted is designed to bleed Russia dry and to weaken them, in perpetuity, really, regardless of the casualties on the Ukrainian side. And of course, Putin's pinning all that on the Americans, which isn't fair because he's bombing civilians and civilian infrastructure and doing all kinds of criminal things, committing war crimes. But of course, all of that blood is just as much as it's on Putin's hands. It's absolutely all over the Joe Biden administration, the Donald Trump administration, the Barack Obama administration, our Congress, George W. Bush, for getting this whole ball rolling, really, the Clintons. And so, the Americans are just as responsible for all of this. But anyway, so now we're to move on to another. We're going to move into the Middle East now, but this is very related. We have a report about a Russian air defense missile that almost hit a MQ-9 Reaper drone over Syria. So this is from Dave DeCamp on the 4th. At antiwar.com. A U.S. MQ-9 Reaper drone was fired at by a Russian SA-22 Panzer air defense system in Syria back in November, a U.S. official told Air and Space Forces magazine. The incident was first revealed by one of the Pentagon documents allegedly leaked by Jack Teixeira. The U.S. official disclosed new information about the incident, saying the Russian missile came within 40 feet of the MQ-9 and damaged the drone when the warhead exploded. The details of the incident are not clear. It's unknown if Russia intentionally fired on the drone or knew if it was a U.S. aircraft. According to the leaked document, the missile was fired from the Qamishli airfield in northeast Syria, an area where both the U.S. and Russian militaries have a presence. Colonel Joe Bucino, a spokesman for U.S. Central Command, told the War Zone that the U.S. and Russian militaries also discussed the incident through their deconfliction lines. He said after the incident, CENTCOM officials contacted the Russian deconfliction center about the matter. Bucino added that such incidents in Syria are not routine. A U.S. MQ-9 Reaper drone had another encounter with Russia over the Black Sea in March, which led to the downing of the drone after it was intercepted by Russian aircraft. The incident in Syria demonstrates the danger of the U.S. presence in the country as it serves as a tripwire for potential conflict with Syria's allies, which include Russia and Iran. And of course, Damascus is strongly opposed to the U.S. occupation of eastern Syria. All right. Now, these are some very interesting stories about Syria. So the U.S. is signaling a shift in its rhetoric on regional engagement with Syria. And to get back to this whole issue of the illegal occupation, there seems to be every week, it seems like the ranks of people who support the status quo, at least the American policy, the status quo of the American policy with respect to Syria, the ranks of those who support them in the region or elsewhere are constantly thinning. And so this, we're going to talk about, this is following the meeting we discussed last week about, where the foreign ministers of Iraq and Egypt and Saudi Arabia and Jordan and Syria all met in Amman and basically declared their support for Syria to retake control of all of its territories and to remove foreign forces and to end foreign intervention in their internal affairs and to, basically bring them in from the cold and look toward national reconciliation and a solution to the crisis and move toward reconstruction. And so this is from Dave DeCamp on May 4th. This is the U.S. sort of reacting to all of that. So a White House National Security Council official told The National that the Biden administration was encouraged by a meeting between Syrian and other Arab foreign ministers that took place in Amman on Monday. The comments mark a significant shift in rhetoric from the U.S., which has previously strongly discouraged regional engagement with the Syrian government of President Bashar al-Assad. The foreign ministers of Syria, Jordan, Saudi Arabia, Iraq, and Egypt issued a joint statement after the meeting last week that said it was the beginning of a process aimed at reaching a solution to the crisis in Syria consistent with Security Council Resolution 2254 and addressing all the consequences of the humanitarian, political, and security crisis. A National Security Council representative told The National that the administration was encouraged to see the joint communique mention many priorities that we and our partners share. The official added that the U.S. hopes, quote, that the Syrian regime will follow through on its commitments in good faith and in accordance with international norms. You could look at that a number of ways, but based on the history of the U.S. policy in Syria over the last 10 years, and particularly with the Biden administration, I'm assuming they mean he should step down and, cede control to a U.S. approved puppet or they wouldn't be. Unfortunately, with the way the situation is, even though that these countries are ready to they're normalizing with Syria and they're ready to bring for this regional realignment. And they want to start trading with Syria again. The U.S. policy for the longest time has been that Assad has to be overthrown or killed, and there really doesn't seem to be much room for adjusting those prerogatives as far as the Americans are concerned. But it's not really. It's looking more and more like it's not really up to them, and they're just going to have to accept reality because Assad isn't going anywhere. And so the official was pleased that the statement mentioned UN Security Council Resolution 2254, which was passed in 2015 and calls for a solution to the crisis in Syria, quote, through an inclusive and Syrian-led political process. Last Tuesday, State Department spokesman Vendat Patel was asked about the meeting in Amman and said, quote, we have seen those reports and understand that a communique was issued by the participants talking about their efforts to reach a solution relating to the crisis in Syria that is consistent with the Security Council resolution. We continue to believe that a political solution outlined in 2254 remains the only viable option to the conflict. The State Department has previously issued strong statements against regional countries normalizing or engaging with Damascus. In February, the State Department opposed the country's upgrading ties with Assad, even as part of an effort to help Syria deal with the earthquake that killed thousands of Syrians, even if it was related to earthquake relief, which is Saudi Arabia started sending aid pretty quickly after the earthquake struck, particularly through the Aleppo airport, which Israel has bombed multiple times since the earthquake occurred. And so U.S. partners in the Middle East have ignored warnings about normalizing with Assad. Saudi Arabia is currently leading the effort to bring Damascus back into the fold and restore Syria's Arab League membership. The Wall Street Journal reported in March that a potential normalization deal with Damascus and its neighbors would involve Arab countries lobbying the U.S. to lift sanctions on Syria, which are, of course, designed to prevent the country's reconstruction until there's regime change. And on top of keeping Syria under sanctions, the U.S., as we always say, maintains an occupation force of about 900 troops in eastern Syria and backs the Kurdish-led SDF in the region. The joint statement released by the Arab foreign ministers on Monday expressed support for Syria regaining control of its territory, which would include those areas occupied illegally by the United States, a fact that was not mentioned by the national security official or the State Department spokesman. The ministers agreed to work to, quote, support Syria and its institutions in any legitimate efforts to extend its control over its lands and impose the rule of law and end the presence of armed and terrorist groups on Syrian lands and stop foreign interference in Syrian internal affairs. Okay, so over the weekend, the Arab League voted to readmit Syria into the Arab League. So this is again from Dave DeCamp. This was on Sunday. The Arab League voted to readmit Syria, marking a significant step in Damascus's efforts to normalize relations with other countries in the region. Syria was suspended from the Arab League after the outbreak of the war in Syria in 2011, and many of the bloc's members threw their support behind the CIA's failed dirty war against Assad, the regime change effort. Now, some members of the Arab League opposed bringing Damascus back into the fold, including Qatar, which did not send its foreign minister to the meeting in Cairo when the vote was held. Foreign ministers from 13 out of 22 Arab League members attended the meeting. Ahmed Abul-Gheit, the Arab League Secretary General, said that Assad could attend the next Arab League summit that will be held in Saudi Arabia later this month. He said, quote, Syria starting from this evening is a full member of the Arab League, and from tomorrow morning they have the right to occupy any seat. Abdul-Gheit also said restoring Syria's Arab League membership does not mean all states are normalizing with Damascus. He said these are sovereign decisions for each state individually. Secretary of State Antony Blinken, as you might expect, expressed his opposition to normalization with the Assad government in a call with his Jordanian counterpart on May 4th. The conversation came after that meeting of the foreign ministers in Amman. And according to the State Department, during the call, quote, Secretary Blinken made clear that the United States will not normalize relations with the Assad regime and does not support others normalizing until there is authentic UN-facilitated political progress in line with UN Security Council Resolution 2254. So they're just hiding behind this Security Council resolution. I think the policy has still not changed, but as I say, they're going to have to accept reality at some point. Now, now it gets worse because Congress, who has voted overwhelmingly to maintain the occupation and maintain the sanctions in the last couple of months on Syria, despite the earthquake, now they're urging Biden to impose harsher sanctions or more severely strengthen the sanctions and apply them in order to prevent any countries from continuing down this path of bringing Syria in from the cold and normalizing relations and opening up trade. And so this is from Dave again on the 9th at antiwar.com. So the top Republican and Democrat on the House Foreign Affairs Committee released a statement on Monday slamming Syria's admission into the Arab League and urging President Biden to use sanctions to prevent further normalization. Readmitting Assad to the Arab League is a grave strategic mistake that will embolden Assad, Russia, and Iran to continue butchering civilians and destabilizing the Middle East, Representative Michael McCaul and Gregory Meeks said. And, last week, McCaul was supporting that bill to make this Clinton-era Iran sanctions law permanent that authorizes the president to impose sanctions without having to have this sunset clause, so it has to be renewed continuously. And really, they don't have any other way to deal with the fact that countries are normalizing with Iran and Syria as a result of interventions by Russia and China, and obviously just the regional actors there realizing that the status quo no longer benefits them, and that it's better to have trade and cooperation and diplomacy than to just be stuck in these rigid Cold War style blocks. Where there's always the threat of war and conflict, and it's essentially bad for business. And there's deeper reasons for that too. But for the reasons why people in the region who see themselves as they're all Muslims and they're all they're much closer to each other than they are to the Americans or the Israelis, for instance. But anyway, so they're just basically every problem is their only response to any of this is to we just need more sanctions. We need more sanctions, or we need to, bomb the IRGC, which is what, of course, Milley promised to do only a couple of months ago after the U.S. bombed Syria a bunch of times. So they're saying the U.S. must fully enforce the Caesar Act and other sanctions to freeze normalization efforts with this war criminal, the lawmakers added, and Republicans and Democrats. And the Caesar Act specifically targets the engineering and construction sectors to prevent Syria from ever rebuilding after this war where Washington and its allies destroyed their country. So, Dave says here, the Caesar Act imposed crushing economic sanctions on Syria in 2020. They're specifically designed to prevent reconstruction. The measures have had a devastating impact on Syria's civilians. Last November, Alina Duhan, the UN Special Rapporteur on Unilateral Coercive Measures, made a 12-day visit to Syria, and she said the sanctions have been an absolute catastrophe. She told the Security Council, quote, in the current dramatic and still deteriorating humanitarian situation, as 12 million Syrians grapple with food insecurity, I urge the immediate lifting of all unilateral sanctions that severely harm human rights and prevent any efforts for early recovery, rebuilding, and reconstruction. And she explained what she called the catastrophic effects of the unilateral sanctions impact people across all walks of life in the country, further stating that 90% of Syria's civilian population lives in poverty with limited access to food, water, shelter, electricity, fuel, healthcare, transportation, etc. Now, as I say, the House recently voted over almost unanimously to keep enforcing these sanctions on Syria, and in the last few months, it's become clear that as I say, that the supporters of this policy is essentially limited to Israel, the Congress, our Congress, the White House, and CENTCOM. What makes these sanctions so sweeping, as Dave says, is that they allow the U.S. to sanction any person or entity for doing business with Damascus, and this means U.S. allies like Saudi Arabia and Jordan, which spearheaded the effort to bring Syria back in the fold, they could potentially be targeted. So, and on Tuesday, Syria and Saudi Arabia announced that they were officially reestablishing their diplomatic ties for the first time in more than a decade. Instead of celebrating that and hailing this progress, they're trying to stop it. The State Department denounced Syria's readmission into the Arab League, of course, and they say we continue to believe that we will not normalize relations with the Assad regime or support our partners or allies who are doing so either. And that was their response to this news from the other day. And so, but again, Syria's normalization with its neighbors will complicate America's plans to continue occupying about a third of the country in the east. And so maintaining or increasing sanctions empowers targeted countries because they seek independence from the U.S.-led order or use of the dollar, and that and the U.S.-led order, of course, is increasingly shrinking as a result of these aggressive bellicose policies targeted at Russia, China, Iran, North Korea, Syria, Venezuela, etc. And it strengthens the emerging multipolar world. So backing Israel's, weekly bombings of the country, stealing Syria's oil and wheat, and dropping bombs on Syrian civilians and territory ultimately only makes matters worse for the empire as well as the Syrian people. But Washington, never entertains any other options. And so they've made themselves increasingly irrelevant by sidelining themselves from all these critical diplomatic breakthroughs, opening the door for China and Russia to help, negotiate peace and open up trade and cooperation between former arch adversaries, pitted against each other largely as a result of these failed destructive American policies. Okay, so continuing on this track, we have another story from Dave. Syrian Turkish foreign ministers hold their first meeting in over a decade. So the Turkish and Syrian foreign ministers held their first meeting in more than a decade on Wednesday in Moscow, as more and more countries are taking steps to rehabilitate their relationship with Damascus. And the meeting was attended by the foreign ministers of Russia and Iran as well, and was intended to build on the progress of other Russian-hosted talks between Syria and Turkey. These efforts started last December when the Turkish and Syrian defense ministers met for the first time since the war in Syria broke out 12 years ago. And according to Al-Mayadeen, the Turkish foreign minister said the officials at Wednesday's meeting would exchange views on the normalization of relations between Turkey and Syria, discuss humanitarian issues, and the voluntary, safe, and dignified return of asylum seekers, which I think is very important for the Turks right now because they have the elections in a few days, and the Syrian refugees have been somewhat of a burden on their economy. And so it would be very popular for Erdogan to find a solution to that situation. The engagement between Damascus and Ankara is significant as Turkey was a major supporter of the failed regime change effort against Assad, and they still currently occupy areas of northern Syria. Damascus has made clear that any deal with Ankara would require the withdrawal of Turkish troops from all Syrian territory. And the Turkish and Syrian officials last met on the 25th of last month in Moscow, when their defense and intel chiefs held talks. After the meeting, a Turkish official said that the condition for a Turkish withdrawal from Syria was the end of the YPG threat in the country, which is referring to the military component of the Syrian Democratic Forces, the Kurdish-led group backed by the U.S., which Turkey considers, much like the PKK, to just essentially, they're a terrorist group, is the way Ankara views it. And so, ending the YPG threat or putting Syria in between Turkey and the Kurds there would require essentially the U.S. leaving the country, because the only way that the Kurds will make a deal with Damascus, or even if they'll just be allowed to make a deal with Damascus, it would have to be in the context of a U.S. withdrawal. And so as we see, more and more forces are building up where there's just no support really anymore for stealing a third of Syria and staying there indefinitely. I don't see how this can be sustainable much longer. Now we're moving on to Yemen. So this is from Dave again on the 4th. Al-Qaeda in Yemen slams Saudi-Iran normalization deal. So according to a report from the New Arab, the leader of the Yemen-based Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, the U.S.'s allies from the Yemen genocide, has slammed Saudi Arabia for its normalization deal with Iran. In a video released last week, AQAP head Khalid Batarfi said Riyadh was conceding defeat in Yemen by normalizing with Iran. But Fari claimed AQAP is the only force left fighting for Sunnis in Yemen against the Houthis, who are Zaidi Shias. The U.S.-backed Saudi-led coalition in Yemen has fought on the same side as AQAP against the Houthis, and weapons sold to the Saudis and the UAE have ended up in the hands of the terror group in Yemen. A report from the AP in 2018 found that the Saudi-UAE coalition hired al-Qaeda members to help fight against the Houthis. The AP report said coalition-backed militias actively recruit al-Qaeda militants or those who were recently members because they're considered exceptional fighters. Before the Obama administration backed the coalition against the Houthis in March 2015, the U.S. was cooperating with the Houthis against AQAP. In January 2015, the Wall Street Journal reported that the U.S. had forged ties with the Houthis as part of a strategy to maintain its fight against a key branch of al-Qaeda. And then shortly after, Lloyd Austin, who had of CENTCOM at the time, turned around and stabbed them in the back, and took al-Qaeda's side. Now, al-Qaeda's complaints about the Saudi-Iran normalization deal come as a peace deal between Riyadh and the Houthis seems near. The warring sides have been engaged in Omani-mediated talks and recently exchanged thousands of prisoners. So this next piece on more Yemen news, this is about a meeting between Jake Sullivan and Mohammed bin Salman, which I wrote for the Libertarian Institute. This news came out this week. Jake Sullivan, I believe, traveled to Saudi Arabia over the weekend, and they discussed a number of things, including Sudan and some infrastructure projects they're trying to do with India and some other countries in the Middle East as a way to combat the Belt and Road Initiative. But what we're focusing on here is the Yemen policy. So U.S. National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan met with Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, also known as MBS, and reviewed significant progress toward peace in the war-torn country of Yemen. Al Jazeera reported on Monday. Sullivan aimed to shore up ties with Saudi Arabia as Riyadh pursues an independent foreign policy in the region, which has reportedly left the U.S. feeling blindsided. In recent months, the Saudis have normalized relations with longtime adversary Tehran, as well as Damascus. A peace deal between the Saudis and the Houthis is nearing, as these Omani-mediated talks have been bearing significant fruit. In February, general cargo ships docked in Yemen's Red Sea port of Hodeidah for the first time since 2016, and last month, relief ships carrying hundreds of containers of food, as well as commercial goods, docked in Hodeidah. Additionally, major prisoner swaps between the warring sides have been taking place, and the current negotiations are working toward a new ceasefire deal that will involve the full lifting of the blockade, eyeing a permanent peace settlement. The White House issued a statement saying that Sullivan, quote, reviewed significant progress in talks to further consolidate the now 15-month-long truce in Yemen and welcomed ongoing UN-led efforts to bring the war to a close, as well as covering a range of other issues. The UN is not involved in the current talks, but is expected to participate in negotiations moving toward a more long-term settlement. The truce is the result of a ceasefire agreement established between the Saudis and the Houthis, which officially held from April to October of 2022, though for well over a year now, there have been no reported Saudi airstrikes in Yemen or Houthi attacks in Saudi Arabia. And while a meeting between the two sides in the Yemeni capital of Sana'a last month ended without a deal, the Houthis committed to continuing the talks soon. The State Department also said that the U.S. Special Envoy for Yemen, Tim Lenderking, visited Oman and Saudi Arabia earlier this month in an effort to help advance the peace process. In 2015, the U.S.-backed Saudi-led coalition launched a brutal war against Yemen's Houthis, who sacked Yemen's capital the previous year. Originally composed of 9 countries, the Saudi coalition imposed a full blockade on the north, where some 70% of the civilian population lives. For several years, Hodeidah was the sole port supplying northern Yemen with food and medicine. Even before the war began, Yemen was already the poorest country in the Middle East, with 90% of Yemenis' food imported from abroad. According to the UN, at least 377,000 people died as a result of the conflict between 2015 and late 2021. Of course, it is estimated that 150,000 were killed as a result of direct violence, while the remaining victims starved to death or perished from diseases linked to the blockade and the Saudis' relentless bombing of civilian infrastructure, including hospitals and clinics. The vast majority of the latter deaths have been children under the age of 5 and babies as well. In December 2022, the White House successfully pressured Congress not to vote on a war powers resolution, which would have cut off the Saudi coalition from any further American military support, helping the carnage to continue despite President Joe Biden's vows to make Riyadh a pariah state. And then just to add, as Dave covered last month, Biden sent high-level officials to the region, including Brett McGurk, the hawkish top Middle East official on Biden's National Security Council. And according to the White House, during the meetings between the U.S. and Saudi officials, even though, as we just said, there hasn't been any major fighting or no reported strikes on either side of the line for well over a year, during those meetings, Washington, quote, confirmed its support for the defense of Saudi Arabia against threats from Yemen and elsewhere, signaling the administration is willing to support Riyadh in its war if the peace process fails. So it's very light on details as far as what Sullivan told MBS, but maybe he said something similar. And so we have to, keep an eye out and see if that changes at all the momentum that's been building, the positive momentum that has been building toward finally a settlement here and some peace for the Yemeni people. Okay. Now, just to cover, Israel has been bombing the open-air prison of Gaza for the last few days. And it's a developing story, but I've got an important story here by Dave from antiwar.com that came out last night. He contacted the State Department and got some quotes, and then I have some further notes on what's been happening since then. So this is from Dave. State Department says Israel has the right to protect itself after Israel's Gaza airstrikes kill 10 civilians. Following the Israeli airstrikes in Gaza that killed at least 10 civilians, including 4 children, the State Department said it supports Israel's right to protect itself. Israel began targeting the Gaza Strip on Tuesday. The overnight assault reportedly involved over 40 Israeli warplanes. According to the Palestinian Health Ministry, the initial round of airstrikes killed 15 people, including 4 children, 6 other civilians, and 3 members of the Palestinian Islamic Jihad. This is what the State Department told antiwar.com in this email yesterday. We are closely following Israeli airstrikes in the Gaza Strip that killed 3 leaders of Palestinian Islamic Jihad. Israel has the right to protect itself and its people from indiscriminate rocket attacks launched by terrorist groups. We were also aware of reports that 10 civilians were tragically killed in the Israeli strikes. We call for all parties to de-escalate the situation, the spokesperson added. So essentially greenlighting what Israel is doing and then just saying this perfunctory way, we support de-escalation on all sides, but they won't do anything to pressure Israel to stop murdering people in a concentration camp. Now, later on Wednesday, the Pentagon said Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin spoke with his Israeli counterpart Yoav Gallant and reaffirmed the U.S.'s ironclad support for Israel. According to the Israeli side, Gallant told Austin that Israel is prepared to wage a prolonged campaign in Gaza. Israeli airstrikes continued in Gaza on Wednesday. At least 6 more people were killed, including a 10-year-old girl and 4 fighters for a group called the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine. Wednesday's strikes brought the total death toll to 21, including 5 children. When asked about the civilian casualties after the first round of airstrikes, the Israeli military said it was aware of some collateral and did not comment further. The Israeli military is dubbing its offensive Operation Shield and Arrow. In response to the Israeli airstrikes, the Palestinian Joint Command, a group of armed factions, resistance factions in Gaza, launched an operation and began firing rockets into Israel. And this has changed, but as of Wednesday night, there had been no reports of casualties on the Israeli side. The fighting showed no signs of waning as of Wednesday night, despite Egypt's efforts to broker a ceasefire. Cairo has mediated previous rounds of fighting between Israel and the besieged Gaza Strip. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, who of course has been facing this political crisis over his planned judicial overhaul, warned, quote, "This round is not over," in a televised address. He said, "We see you everywhere. You can't hide, and we choose the place and time to strike you," he said. So just some updates here. Since Tuesday morning, Israeli fighter jets launched airstrikes in several locations across Gaza, including in Rafah, Khan Yunis, Bet Lahia, and other areas. The Israeli military claims that they hit more than 50 targets as blasts sounded across Gaza. The Palestinian armed group Islamic Jihad said 3 Gaza houses, which appeared to have been evacuated after warnings, were struck after dark on Wednesday. The Israeli offensive comes a week after a brief exchange of fire between Israel and Palestinian groups in Gaza left 1 Palestinian killed and 2 Israelis wounded. This was triggered by the death of the famed Palestinian anti-occupation activist Khader Adan's death in an Israeli prison cell following an 87-day hunger strike. And before this most recent canned hunt by the Israelis, which has killed women and children, the total number of Palestinians killed by the Israeli forces and settlers since the beginning of this year was already 104, including 17 children. The latest bombing of Gaza is the largest attack mounted by Israel against the open-air concentration camp since August last year, when the military assassinated senior Palestinian Islamic Jihad commander Taisir al-Jabari, triggering a 3-day exchange of fire. In that exchange, 49 Palestinians were killed in the Israeli bombardment, including 17 children and 360 other people. And this could be as bad as what we saw in 2021 in May, when Israel bombed Gaza for 11 days and killed over 250 people, including, I believe, over 60 children. It was absolutely devastating. And more than 2 million Palestinians, of course, are packed into Gaza. It's 25 by 5 miles, one of the most densely populated areas in the world, under blockade by Israel since 2007. The besieged coastal enclave has been described as the world's largest open-air prison. Israeli shelling continued today, and this is Thursday, but I think the show will come out tomorrow, killing more people. As of the latest reports, the death toll in Gaza has now reached 28, including 5 children. There's another story people can read at Middle East Eye, about a boy named Tamim Dawood, who was a 4-year-old Palestinian boy nearing his 5th birthday. He died of a panic attack in Gaza, which led his heart to stop functioning on the way to a hospital in the middle of the overnight Israeli bombing. Dozens more Gazans have been injured as well. Most estimates count that at least 80 have been injured so far, and one Israeli has also reportedly been killed as of today. It looks like a condominium was hit with one of the rockets. Since the bombing of Gaza started, Jake Sullivan has spoken with his Israeli counterpart, I can never pronounce his name, Shaki Hanegbi, on the same day, reaffirming America's, quote, ironclad support for Israel's security. This is from the White House readout. U.S. Ambassador to Israel Tom Nides at the same time issued a statement backing Israel's, quote, right to defend itself. Netanyahu is framing Operation Shield and Arrow as a fight against Iran and its allies. According to the Jerusalem Post, Israel is ready to fight Iran on multiple fronts if it needs to. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu said on Tuesday, following the launch of the Operation Shield and Arrow. In separate comments, Netanyahu said 95% of Israel's security problems come from Iran, referring to an attempt by Iran to start a multi-front campaign against us. Israel, quote, will do all it can to prevent Iran from establishing terror fronts around us. Netanyahu also said, of course, that Israel will do all it can to stop Iran from obtaining a nuclear weapon, which they don't have and they're not trying to obtain. Netanyahu and Defense Minister Gallant did not convene the Security Cabinet before Operation Shield and Arrow, receiving permission from the Attorney General to do so. They originally planned to target Gaza on last Friday, but they waited for technical reasons, they're saying. The small forum that decided to launch the operation did not include the far-right National Security Minister Itamar Ben-Gvir, who was very much involved in the crisis in Sheikh Jarrah in East Jerusalem that led to that horrible 11-day bombing campaign back in May of 2021. Now he's the National Security Minister. He boycotted this week's cabinet meeting and whose faction members did not take part in the Knesset meetings and votes in protest of a lack of response to these little rockets fired from Gaza. In response to, as I said, there was a killing of 3 Palestinians in Nablus, an Israeli raid. There was obviously there was no due process or anything involved. They accused 3 guys of committing the murder of 3 British Israeli settlers in the Jordan Valley, and then in the village of Nablus, or the town of Nablus, they just went over with a shoulder-fired missile, surrounded it, the Shin Bet and their security forces, and they just blew the house up. So that may have been related as well. But they, he's saying that they boycotted the Knesset and all these meetings because they hadn't bombed Gaza yet. So on Tuesday, when the bombs started dropping, Ben-Gvir tweeted, "It's about time." According to the Times of Israel, as y'all might expect, Defense Minister Yoav Gallant on Thursday said that Iran has amassed enough fissile material for 5 nuclear bombs, warning the Islamic Republic against further enriching uranium toward weapons-grade levels. So as usual, as they're bombing the Gazans and committing horrible war crimes, which is pretty much what Israel does, the world's most notorious apartheid state, they always have to point their finger at Iran to distract attention from that, which the U.S. media and all the Israeli firsters and in the government and the press, and they're all going to follow suit. Unfortunately, it's absolutely devastating. But as I say, this is developing, and we'll have a lot more to cover about what's been going on in Gaza next week.
All right, Connor, thank you so much for the breakdown. Everybody, thank you for tuning in. We'll be back with more shows next week. Thanks.